Is the mic on now? Okay. Okay, good. Sorry about that. Verse 4 says, "Now I know that this is the Great Spirit, and he has come down at this time to preserve your lives." Okay, so the king is assuming that this Great Spirit is here specifically to preserve the lives of his servants. Now, that might be self-evident from the fact that he saved the flocks from being scattered, which then saves the servants from being killed, but there might be a little bit more to that. He goes on and he says that I might not slay you as I did your brethren. Wait a second, how come he doesn't say my brethren? How come he says your brethren? Did you ever notice that? Now, this is the Great Spirit of whom our fathers have spoken. So he's getting his knowledge of this Great Spirit from his fathers, but it is not a Great Spirit that is commonly worshipped among his people, because he refers to it as knowledge from his fathers, but not as self-evident knowledge of worshipers who worship the Great Spirit. Okay? Notice that in the king's reply, he says that the Great Spirit has come down. That's kind of significant because at that time period, most of the people and most of the records that we have from that time period, the gods lived under the earth. And they came up when they wanted to do something on the earth. So the fact that he says he has come down is an allusion to this ancient knowledge of his fathers, but he assumes that he is like a sky god. Okay, because we find out a little bit later he's got no concept of heaven. Doesn't know what heaven is. So he's assuming maybe that he is a sky god. And also notice that he doesn't say our brethren, that he says your brethren. And in verse 5, Mormon sticks in kind of an editorial comment on the beliefs of the Lamanites at this point, saying, now this was the tradition of Lamoni that he had received from his father, that there was a great spirit. Notwithstanding that they believed in a great spirit, they supposed that whatsoever they did was right. Now that harkens back a little bit to the things that the Amalekites were teaching and the things that the Nehorites were teaching and that were adopted by many of the Nephites, as they taught that you can't do anything wrong, that whatever gain that you get in this life comes because of the strength that God gave you, and therefore it is godly to get whatever you can and to do whatever you can in order to forward your life. And that's kind of what the kings are saying here. But he does seem a little bit later on to apply this specifically to the kings. So this seems to be a prerogative of Lamanite kings to do whatsoever they please. A little bit like king worship. So they supposed that whatsoever they did was right. Nevertheless, Lamoni began to fear exceedingly, with fear lest he had done wrong in slaying his servants. If he believes that he has done, that everything that he does is right, why is he all of a sudden starting to fear? What about this great spirit makes him fear? Because if he's doing everything right, then the great spirit will just pat him on the back and say, you did everything right, but I wanted these ones in particular saved. Because I like this Ammon boy, so you can't kill him. Okay? Why is he afraid? And that's a question we ought to be asking. What's causing him to be so afraid? So let's take a look at a couple of things that we know. Verse 6 goes on to say, for he had slain many of them because their brethren, not his brethren, had scattered their flocks at the place of water. And thus, because they had their flocks scattered, they were slain. The spirit was not practiced by King Lamoni. He was not familiar with who he was as a god and what his expectations of people were, which is part of where his fear comes from not knowing what those expectations are. But he did recognize the existence of a great spirit as taught by his father. However, the king's Lamoni and his father, believing that what they did was right, they had no reason to fear this great spirit based on just the past killings of servants. Why had the Great Spirit not acted before this point in time? He's not sure of what's going on. He's very uncertain as to what kind of territory he is treading in relationship to a God right now on earth. So why would the king assume that the Great Spirit would appear in a Nephite individual as opposed to a Lamanite individual? If they believe that they are the superior brethren of these two cultures, why would they assume that the Great Spirit would be in a Nephite body? Okay, it's another question I want you to ponder for a second as we discover some of the answers here. So, why is this fear related specifically to the deaths of the servants? Why do they think he appeared in a Nephite body? Let's first look back at chapter 17, verse 26. And I want you to notice something here that's very interesting. It's only used twice in the entire Book of Mormon, this word. 2 times. And after he had been in the service of the king 3 days, as he was with the Lamanite-ish servants going forth with their flocks. He was not with Lamanite servants. He was with Lamanite-ish servants. Now, what is that exactly? What's that mean? I want you to also note, and we'll be going over this in the future when we get there, that in chapter 19, verse 16, Abish, a servant of the Lamanite queen, is also characterized as Lamanite-ish. You should remember that she was converted because of a vision had by her father. Okay? She's spoken of as Lamanite-ish as well. Those are the only 2 places where that word is ever used in the Book of Mormon. Okay? Now, so the Lamanites have got an idea in their head, and somehow this idea is connected with Lamanite-ish servants. And the servants referred to each other as brethren, and Ammon referred to his fellow servants as brethren, but the king does not refer to them as brethren. Are you getting a picture here of what might be happening? What might be going on and who these servants might be? So, and Ammon referred to them as brethren in chapter 31, or verse 31 of chapter 17. So these servants were the ones first targeted as the choice by Ammon to convert. He wasn't going to convert the king at first. That was not his first modus operandi. His thoughts, as we have them recorded in the Book of Mormon, were to impress these his brethren and convert them. He saw them as a more ripe opportunity, as some of the low-hanging fruit that then might help him to influence the rest of the Lamanite culture. All right? Later, during the conversation of the king of Lamoni, we learned that this Great Spirit in chapter 19, verses 20 through 27, is associated with the Nephites because he always attended the Nephites and was the God who destroyed the Lamanites. Let me read the verses to you. How's that? Alma 19, verses 25 through 27. And it came to pass that there were many among them who said that Ammon was the Great Spirit, and others said he was sent by the Great Spirit. But others rebuked them all, saying he was a monster who had been sent from the Nephites to torment them. And there were some who said that Ammon was sent by the Great Spirit to afflict them because of their iniquities, and that it was the Great Spirit that had always attended the Nephites, who had ever delivered them out of their hands. And they said it was the Great Spirit who had destroyed so many of their brethren, the Lamanites. So they associate the Great Spirit with the Nephites and with the ability of the Nephites to be able to overcome the Lamanites in battle. Okay? Well, now that begins to shed some light on why the Lamanite king might start being afraid, because he's been killing some Lamanite-ish servants, or perhaps some Nephites who had come into the Lamanite lands because they dissented from previous kings, or maybe existed in the Lamanite lands because they never left with King Mosiah the first, because King Mosiah only took about 20% of the people with him, of the Nephites, and they remained behind and became servants to the Lamanites. But they had adopted the culture of the Lamanites, and so they were Lamanite-ish, but they still didn't look exactly like the Lamanites. And Ammon was able to identify them as his brethren and thought that they would have softer hearts concerning the gospel of Christ. That is what some Latter-day Saint scholars are saying about these circumstances. Now, so let's go on. The Great Spirit seemed to always have protected the Nephites, and this is what caused the king to fear that the Great Spirit had an affinity to his servants and not to him, and therefore had come to punish him. Now, the fact that these servants are emphasizing to the king that he is a friend of the king, that he's doing this to preserve the king's flocks, that he's doing this to serve diligently the king. The fact that Ammon had been such a diligent servant is probably part of what mitigates the king's response to just like sending a whole bunch of people out to just try to slay him. Okay? Because he had been such a diligent servant. Now, during the long conversion process, I mean, it's really only 3 days, but boy, when somebody is passed out, everybody else in the society, for them, it's a very long time that this is going on. But during this conversion of Lamoni, we learn that the Great Spirit is associated with the Nephites because he is the God of the Nephites. Now, from these verses, we can extract some ideas about what the Great Spirit is like. And we can see some of the traditions of what this Great Spirit is like in the writings of ancient Mayans and Mayan texts. Let me share some of those with you. So let's start with this. In verse 13 of chapter 18, when the king has recognized the Great Spirit, and Ammon comes into the king, and he sees that the king's countenance has changed. Instead of being commanding and in charge, now the king is kind of timid and silent with him, and is not knowing how to treat him or how to deal with him. And so Ammon's about to turn around and leave, and what do the servants say? The servants speak up on the king's behalf. What do they say to Ammon, whom the king perceives as the Great Spirit? They call him by a title. Do you remember what the title is? Yeah, Rabbana. And Rabbana, that has some Semitic, Hebrew, and Aramaic roots. And in both Hebrew and in Aramaic, it means great one, or great king, or great ruler, one that is above everybody else. We have seen that word, similar versions of that word, used concerning Christ in the terms of Rabbi and Rabboni. Okay, the I on the end means my great one. So Rabboni or Rabbon is very much like this word Rabban, only it's Rabbon I, and that means my great one, or my Lord, my distinguished above everybody else person. So they call him the Great One. That's going to be significant in a minute, so hold on to that thought. And they are considering that he is powerful. They've just expressed that he is a powerful individual. And Mormon's commentary kind of highlights two terms that the Lamanites use to transition from this understanding of the Great Spirit into faith in Christ. And those two terms are great and power. We're going to see those two terms repeated in the next couple of chapters here as the definition of the Great Spirit is discussed and as Ammon reveals who is the source of the power that is within him. that it's not him, but that it is Jesus Christ. Now, Ammon admits from the very outset that it's not him and that he draws on that divine power. And that idea of that divine power being drawn on by a mortal is something that existed within the concept of the religion of the Lamanites. That was something that they were familiar with. And he was easily able to take that and turn that into a belief in Jesus Christ. Now, just as a side note, there's a lesson to be learned here. Ammon is taking a very different concept of God used by the Lamanites and believed by the Lamanites, and is trying to help them or move them to an understanding of the power through love that Jesus Christ has for all mankind. Because the powerful God that they imagine as a God of destruction and death and anger and wrath and vengeance. And he's trying to move them to a God who loves. And so that's part of what he's doing here. But what he's doing that's really fantastic is he's starting where they're at. He doesn't jump in and just say, oh, no, your gods aren't real. You know, this is the only real God, and this is what his nature and character is, and this is what you need to believe. He actually starts with where they're at. If you're talking to non-member friends, start with where they're at. They may have a different view of Jesus Christ than you did, just like the Lamanites had a different view of God as the Great Spirit than Ammon did. They might have a different idea of how Christ relates to mankind than you do, or than is taught in Scripture. But if you start where they are at, if you find your common ground, then it's easier to talk to people about what they believe and just slightly steer those beliefs in a different direction until they reach the point where they are open enough to accept revelation from the Lord about who he is. Open enough to accept asking God themselves about who he is. So he's exemplifying some wonderful teaching techniques here. Ammon is. Now, the Lamanites seem to believe that the Great Spirit acted as a divine warrior in behalf of the Nephites, and maybe in behalf of the cosmos as a whole. Okay? The belief can be traced back to the Old Testament, where God is called by many titles that include warrior titles, where he is the God who defends his covenant people. We see the stories of his defending his covenant people regularly in the scriptures in the Old Testament, where God comes to their rescue, or where he sends only a limited number of people out against a whole huge army so that he can show that he's the one that conquered the army and it was not the 300 soldiers of Gideon. Okay? It would not be difficult to understand how the warrior God would get translated down from their fathers, who originally came from Jerusalem, but through a construal of the favor that God shows towards the Nephites as an unjust kind of favor. Okay? Now, there are some characteristics that belong to this divine warrior who comes to defend his people. And the language and the belief system that is common to the traditions of other nations throughout the world in their warrior gods is also common to the traditions concerning Jehovah, the warrior God of the Jews. So this common ideology that is expressed is one of, I will protect my people. I can perform miracles in the process of protecting my people. If you don't hearken to me, and if you do anything against my people, I will destroy you. You can see that with the Egyptians. You can see that with the Amalekites that were from the Old Testament time period, the ones that attacked the Jews while they were wandering in the wilderness and starving. Okay? And God says, destroy them all, every last one, everything that they owned and everything that they lived in. Don't take any spoil, destroy them all, because they sought to destroy my covenant people. And you remember that Saul didn't manage to carry that off, right? And that a descendant of that king was allowed to be born and flourish in captivity under the reign of Saul, and that descendant became the ancestor of Haman, the individual that sought to have all of the Jews killed while they were in Babylon. Okay, so because Saul didn't do what God commanded, he rose up again and tried to destroy the Jews again, as his ancestors had done. Now, rather than, as the Lamanites look at the fighting skills of Ammon, this makes Ammon ideal to represent this God that has such great strength, doesn't seem to be able to be slain, doesn't seem to be able to be conquered, has expertness around flocks and nature, because we're going to find out in a minute that this great spirit is also associated with creation. And that Ammon just kind of exemplified these characteristics of what little they did know about the Great Spirit. And he was a Nephite, right? So it would only make sense that the Great Spirit would come in a Nephite body, because he favors the Nephites, according to Lamanite tradition. Now, rather than confirm these beliefs, Ammon instead talks about how the divine, how God has favored him, not because of his strength, but because of his desire to serve and because of his love. And so he teaches the doctrine of Christ, beginning with faith. And so to do so, he asks, will you hearken? If I tell you who I am, if I tell you what is going on here, will you hearken unto my words? If I tell thee by what power I do these things, in verse 22 of chapter 18. So he gets a commitment from the king to act in faith. Ammon then goes on to show that Jesus Christ is the ultimate source of his power, and that Jesus Christ ultimately has the power needed to save and deliver all people. Because he does have the power to deliver the Nephites, but he has the power to deliver anybody that is in a covenant relationship with him. Now, let's talk for a minute about, that's kind of where Alma goes with that story. We'll come back to him in a minute. But if the descendants of Lehi settled in South America, which is the proposition that we're throwing out to you right now, that I'm throwing out to you right now, then it is appropriate to compare some of the writings of the ancient Southern American peoples, like the Mayans, to the writings of the Book of Mormon, to see common ideas or common threads of the culture of the same time period in those areas. When we look at Mayan writings, they have a god in the Mayan system of beliefs who is called Ukuxka, or sometimes he is called, and that name means the heart of heaven, by the way, and sometimes he is called Hakakan. So this god, Ukux, or Cooks for short if you want, that's how they shorten the name down, he is the only one to appear in Mayan theology that is involved in every stage of the creation. Now, what's interesting is that this God, who is involved in every stage of the creation, as well as all of the rest of their theology, their mythology about the world and how the world first came into being and how some of the first good and bad acts were ever done, these historical portions, what they considered their mythological history, Cooks refers to the heart and the source or the vital spirit of a thing. Kind of like the one who breathes life into man and the one who breathes upon the waters and they begin to have life in them. The vital spirit of a thing. It's also believed, he is also believed to be at the center of thought and imagination and creativity. That he combined the powers of life that he had and the power of creativity that he had to make the earth and everything in it, and that he is therefore the author of everything created under the skies, under the heavens. Now, another name, like I said, is, well, another name, Hurakan, is a word that means that both fire and water. So it's made out of two words, Huru and Khan, fire and water. So it's believed that this god is a water god and a fire god. Well, that's interesting as we consider the waters of the flood and the fires of the destruction of the last days, or as we consider the waters of baptism and the fire of baptism by the Spirit that is associated with Jesus Christ. It's kind of interesting. This God also, this deity, is linked to both spirit and greatness. Okay? His name conjures up images or thoughts or conversations of the greatness of this God. Now, he's considered, like I said, a God of creation, but as Ammon asks Lamoni, believest thou that the Great Spirit, and this is in verses 28 and 29 of chapter 18, believest thou that the Great Spirit, who is God, created all things which are in heaven and in the earth? Lamoni replies, yes, I believe that he created all things. So they had this idea already that the Great Spirit had created all things. But then he says something interesting, but I do not know the heavens. I don't know what you mean by this heavens. What is this heavens? Is it above the sky? What is it? And Ammon confirms that yes, it is above the sky, but Ammon's theology did not include the idea that gods came down from the sky or above the sky. His theology included the idea that they came up from underneath the earth. Sorry, Lamoni's theology. Lamoni's theology was not that gods came down from the sky. So, likewise, this great creator God of the Mayans created all things, although many other deities assisted in the creation. They did so, according to Mayan belief, according to the plan that was laid out by this great God. Go ahead. Yeah, there's three different ways to spell it in English because it's a transliterated word, which means that it can be hard to find the right consonants. And the common usage is with a Jurakan. It is also spelled Huracan, and its Mayan title, the Mayan word for it, is U space capital K with a little hyphen mark, semicolon, apostrophe, with an apostrophe, and then UX, and then space capital KAJ, remembering that the J is an H sound in Mayan, just like it is in Spanish. Okay? So he is considered the originator of all of creation, although he employed actors in the creation to get certain jobs done. Does that sound familiar at all? Okay. And as the great creator who originated everything, he conceived the idea of forming the earth. He conceived everything that would appear upon it, and the other deities just carried out his expression into the material world, his concepts and ideas into the material world. Now, he's considered a god of knowledge. And when Lamoni learns of Ammon's great power in defending his flocks and enemies, the king wonders, art thou the great spirit who knows all things? He asks that in chapter 18, verse 18. Are you the great spirit who knows all things? Well, this God of the Mayans was considered to be the God who knows all. All right? He is a God of retribution and destruction. Before the king learned the particulars of the God that Aaron was presenting to him, Lamoni wondered, behold, is not this the great spirit who doth send such great punishments upon this people because of their murders? He asks that in chapter 18, verse 2. So they see him as a god of retribution for, in this case, murder. In addition to being the most important god of the Quiche pantheon and the Mayan pantheon, Druacan was greatly feared. Men and even other gods wanted to remain in his favor. All of the rest of the gods of the pantheon were afraid of this god as well. Okay, he didn't interact with man very often. Usually the other gods did. He sent messengers to men. He didn't interact with men, but they were all afraid of him. And they all wanted to remain in his favor. Now, part of this trepidation comes because he is the god of storms. And if he came riding on a storm that was devastating to human beings and animals, lands, crops, buildings. It could wipe out a whole civilization, this storm. This God was known to be able to wipe out civilizations. Does that sound like the flood? The heck, does that sound what Christ is going to do when he comes to the Americas, right before he comes to the Americas, after his death and resurrection? Or at his death? Okay, whole civilizations are going to be wiped out. This is what they believed this God was capable of doing. He is also the God who dwells in the heavens. Ammon taught Lamoni that the heavens is a place where God dwells with all of his holy angels in verse 30. As a supreme deity, Druacan acts on all levels of the universe, although his major role is played from the sky. His appearance on earth and in the underworld is generally through one of his messengers. So he interacts with man through his messengers. For example, he used in Mayan mythology the hero twins to initiate challenges in the world and to overthrow the proud and capricious rulers of the people, such as Seven Macaw and the Lords of Death. Seven Macaw was a title of a king. The Lords of Death were his army, his servants. And these two twins, the hero twins, were inspired by God to fight them and to take them down, to remove them from their torturous rule over the people. So he sends messengers. Like any religious or great political leader, he sends messengers to collect data, to make observations, to carry messages for him. And these messengers oftentimes give advice and moral support to mortals. That's one of the things that they believe. He's the source of divine power to others. Ammon explained to Lamoni that this power and strength that he possessed came from God. Okay? A portion of that spirit dwelleth in me, he says in verse 35. Which giveth me knowledge and also power according to my faith and desires which are in God. As a leader, Druacan is also helpful to the other gods and to his messengers and to the heroes and to the people and to nature itself. He not only provides them with energy to function, but gives them moral support and stamina that is vital to complete the deeds that they have been assigned to do. We call that grace in the Christian faith. While the setting of the land of Nephi and other Book of Mormon locations are unknown, Ammon's conversation with Lamoni fits very well if Lamoni's understanding of the Great Spirit is similar to the Mayan understanding of Ukuxka. They're very similar deities. Now, that isn't to say that everything about them is exactly the same, but they are similar enough to cause you to wonder and say, how much influence on this faith did the faith of the children of Lehi have when they came over to this continent? Maybe it originated with them. Maybe it morphed out of the worship of Jehovah through iniquity, or maybe it combined with the religion of other indigenous peoples that were here at the time, because there were other people here, just not writing records that managed to come down into our hands in these latter days. Okay? Now, So, having said that, knowing that the king has a preconceived idea of what this Great Spirit is like, what he does for the Nephites, how he interacts with the Lamanites, what his capabilities are, and what he is known for, Ammon starts with what the king knows and can relate to and begins to teach him. So let's take a look at those verses as Ammon does that. So in verse 12, in verse 11, we have the idea that the king recognizes this is the Great Spirit and would desire that he comes in, but does not wish to summon him because summoning the Great Spirit might just bring a mighty storm that destroys all of his people. Okay? And it came to pass that when Ammon had made the horses and the chariots for the king and his servants, so he just got through doing not only all of his work, but the work of all the rest of the servants who are in testifying to the king. And now he's come back to report to the king and find his fellow servants. He goes into the king, and he saw that the countenance of the king was changed. Therefore, he was about to return out of his presence. Now, we talked about how the countenance of the king had changed already. And one of the king's servants said unto him, Rabbana, which is being interpreted powerful or great king, considering their king to be powerful, they considered all of their kings to be powerful. And thus he said unto him, Rabbana, the king desireth thee to stay. Now Ammon turned around to the king, and he said unto him, What wilt that I should do for thee, O king? So he's automatically putting himself back into the role of servant and saying, What task do you have for me to do next? And the king did not answer him. For the space of an hour, Ammon stood there waiting on the king. Now talk about some really good patience. Right? How many of us are not so good with silence, and when we ask a question, we don't manage to wait for an hour for somebody to formulate their thoughts. We start prompting them. We start putting words into their mouth. Do you want this? Is this what you need? What are you thinking, king? We start trying to draw a conversation out. But Ammon was exceptionally patient, and he allowed the king to gather his thoughts for an hour. Why do you think he needed an hour to gather his thoughts?
Well, because it's going to be really different from what he has believed.
Okay, it is going to be really different. He has no idea how different it's going to be. He's probably imagining multiple different scenarios. How do you ask a question of a God without offending the God and getting struck dead by a bolt of lightning? Okay, how do I interview this God? How do I treat this individual? He's treating me like I'm a king and he's a servant. How do I treat him back? How do I respond properly to him? He's probably got a lot of things going through his head and the fear of death lying behind them all. Okay? So therefore, the king answered him not for the space of an hour according to their time, for he knew not what he should say unto him. And it came to pass that Ammon said unto him again, after an hour, What desirest thou of me? But the king answered him not. So it went beyond an hour before Ammon asked him again. And it came to pass that Ammon, being filled with the Spirit of God, therefore he perceived the thoughts of the king. And he said unto him, Is it because thou hast heard that I defended thy servants and thy flocks, and slew 7 of their brethren with the sling and with the sword, and smote off the arms of others, in order to defend thy flocks and thy servants? Behold, is this what causeth thy marvelings? So Ammon has a pretty insightful guess as to what is going on in the king's head. You'll notice from this is where we find out that he slew 6 by the sling and 1 by the sword, because earlier we found out that he slew only 1 by the sword. But then the rest of them, with the sword, he cut off their arms. Anyone that lifted up an arm against him. And when the king heard these words, he marveled again. This is verse 18. For he beheld that Ammon could discern his thoughts. Notwithstanding this, King Lamoni did open his mouth and said unto him, Who art thou? Art thou that great spirit who knows all things? Okay, so the questions have begun. Ammon now has an opening to teach King Lamoni, which is not something he was expecting or striving for. His intention had been to teach and to convert the servants. But he's now standing before the king. And this is an interesting phrase that says that the king did open his mouth. Of course, you've got to open your mouth to speak. Why do we use the phrase open his mouth right here when previously you don't hear that phrase very often? It tends to be that they just say, the king said this, Ammon said this. Why here does it say the king opened his mouth? He had been silent for an hour, and it was a momentous moment because of how intimidating it was to open your mouth before a God. So it was a significant thing to open your mouth, which is an idiom for speaking freely. Okay? It's a Hebrew idiom, one of the many that are found in the Book of Mormon. So there are parallels to this that can be found in the Old Testament as well. For example, Job spoke of opening his mouth and cursing the day that he was born, when he was in the middle of his great trials. And let's see, Daniel it says he opened his mouth and spake unto the king. So these are situations where they could have tremendous downsides or tremendous consequences. All right? Now, as we're going through these, remember that we are looking at two things. We are looking for examples of faith, and we are looking for examples of Alma as a type for Christ. Right? Those are the two things that we've been looking for and talking about. So tell me, what examples of faith have we seen thus far in these verses? Sorry for needing to sit. My physical therapist really did me a wonder yesterday. Well, I don't know. It doesn't feel good right now. What examples of faith do we see? On the part of anybody in this scenario.
The king is always asking.
So the king is asking. He's extending himself. He's kind of putting himself in what he sees as a threatening situation in order to try to understand. Okay, the servants had a kind of faith, not in something that they knew what they were having faith in, but in Ammon. Okay, they had faith to tell the story and to bring all of the arms in to show the king and to make sure the king understood that it was Ammon and not them. They didn't take credit for this. They could have, but they didn't. A huge mob of people. Many more than that. He had faith to fight off all of these Lamanites. Yeah. Okay, the king had the power to sentence him to death at any time, and he had the faith to be able to be bold in front of the king and speak to him. What in particular was he bold in saying? Could have been bold to say, I'm not the Great Spirit when he gets around to saying it, because then he doesn't have any protection left. But what about like right there in that verse that we just read where he is bold in speaking what he believes the king to be thinking? And he has faith that what thoughts have come into his head have come from the Lord and are indicative of where the king's mind is at. So he acted on that by asking questions accordingly. Have you ever been in a situation like that where using the gift of discernment, the Lord has helped you to understand what somebody else was thinking when maybe you shouldn't have understood it, and that you've been able to work with that individual and help to bring them closer to God as a consequence of that? Nobody has ever had that experience? You guys, I've had that experience so many times in my life, I can't believe you haven't had it at least once. Oh, yeah, we're all old. We can't remember. But no, really.
I usually say something, and then I think, oh, that was the wrong thing, and I think, and I second guess it until they come back and say, oh, that really was helpful.
Okay, good.
And I feel like pulling back.
Awesome.
Here's one example. People will tell me I have said something to them. I have no recollection of it because it wasn't my brain, it wasn't my word.
Okay, I understand that. That's happened to me before too. When the Lord speaks through us, sometimes we don't retain exactly what was said. And if anything, sometimes, because it wasn't our words, it was the words from the Spirit. Okay, often if the priesthood are inspired in their blessings that they are giving, then oftentimes those words flow without them knowing what they were going to say ahead of time. They might have had an idea of what they wanted to say going in, but then when the Spirit takes over, something else comes out. Okay, I know that Denise has a grandson that had an experience like that. Denise, talk loud. Do you need the microphone? Maybe you should come up here. Yep, so that I don't have to repeat your story. I just want to know his experience. Yeah.
So my cute little grandson, who's just turned 8 yesterday, is getting ready to get baptized, and I challenged all my grandkids to read the Book of Mormon. And he read it and had a very spiritual experience with it, which was very sweet and tender. But then the fast Sunday that came up in January, he felt inspired to stand up, and he really wanted to bear his testimony about the promise that Moroni gives. And his mom, my daughter, was like, no, don't do that. And she said, well, he could get up there and read it. And so he got up there and shared his testimony. And then later that week, Shelby received a text from the missionaries who said that they had brought a woman who was investigating the church. And when my little grandson, his name is Zeke, stood up and bore his testimony and challenged, the challenge to read the Book of Mormon, that the Spirit bore witness to her, the investigator, that the church was true. And so she is now going to get baptized.
Sometimes we have those inspirations and we don't even find out until later that they had an effect. And I bet you that there are hundreds of those kinds of moments that we're going to find out after this life had an effect in people's lives that we don't even know about. But those kinds of moments where you are inspired to say or to do something happen, and you should watch for them to happen, because they are moments where God is working through you, where Lamoni's great spirit is working through you just like it did through Ammon. So Ammon, using that moment of understanding, that moment of needing to speak and to say the words that he had no idea why he needed to say them necessarily, but knew that it was time. He knew that it was going to be a teaching moment. Now, you'll remember that last week I taught you that part of the way that a person knows those moments in ancient times was because they recognized something similar happening before. Wherein is Ammon able to recognize this scenario happening before? There were multiple times King David comforted Saul with the words of the Lord through Psalms. Elijah, the prophet, speaking to Ahab, bore the words of the Lord to Ahab making it so that Ahab, with all of his men there about to kill Elijah, basically tells his men to let him go. Let him go, we're not going to kill him. Because of the testimony that was born. He can see that there is a moment here where there is a life and death situation going on potentially. And he bears testimony and sees the evidence of the testimony that the king's spirit is calmed. And so he knows what to do next. Tell more about what God has said. Bring more of that spirit into the room. Okay, good indications to us too. Good indications. If we can feel the spirit as we're talking to somebody, it's a good opening to keep talking about spiritual things, to keep the warm feeling flowing. Even if they don't recognize what the warm feeling is about. But the king, not knowing that this was about the spirit, recognizes that something is up and is marveling that he knows his thoughts. What about, Ammon probably saw all of the servants gathering up all of the arms. He knows the tradition of presenting the arms to the king. He knows that the enemies that had been punished would be counted from that, and that probably there would be some payment going out to the servants for that. That would have been traditional. Why is it that Ammon's understanding of the king's thoughts in that moment should be a marvel when it kind of would seem self-evident to any of us? Doesn't it seem self-evident to you? It seems self-evident to me. What about what it is that Ammon says reflects enough of what the king is thinking for the king to marvel? Because it has to be beyond the circumstances that the servants have reported to the king. So, can you see it in the words in the verse? That the worries of the king, which have been about the servants that he had killed previously, are known to Ammon. That's exactly right. And it causes the king's marvelings. Okay, because in their society and in their culture, nobody cares about the life of some Nephite or half Nephite servants. So, all right. Typifications of Christ in here. Do you see any typifications of Christ in these verses? Okay, Christ was often able to tell what people were thinking. Good.
He says, I'm thy servant.
He says he calls himself a servant. Good. Did Christ have patience with the people around him, waiting until they could exercise their faith and then perform the miracles? Yeah.
He had no fear in front of the leaders.
Okay, he didn't have any fear before any of the leaders that could have killed him during his day. Anything else? Those that would hearken, he treated gently, didn't he? Ammon is treating the king gently. Okay. Ammon acted in a way like a shepherd over the flocks, right? And a servant of the servants. Okay. We'll come back to more of that list as we read more of these verses. Let's see. It came to pass. Oh, wait, that just skipped. Sorry, I have to pull up my scriptures here because I just lost them. John, I may need to use your phone because I don't think this is connecting to the internet.
You want my phone, Tina?
Yeah, I just need the LDS app. Thanks. Is this in the right chapter already? Thank you. Okay. And then verse 17, he says, I say unto you, what is it that thy marvelings are so great? Behold, I am a man, and am thy servant. Therefore, whatsoever thou desirest, which is right, I will do. In verse 18, now when the king had heard these words, he marveled again, for he beheld that Ammon could discern his thoughts. But notwithstanding this, King Lamoni did open his mouth and said unto him, who art thou? Art thou that great spirit who knoweth all things? Who knows all things? So Ammon is perceiving that not only is he worried about who he is, he's also perceiving that he's threatened by him. And Ammon's reassuring him, no, I'm just a man. I'm your servant. Okay, that's all I am. And this, again, is a marvel to the king. Now, when the king, when Ammon answered, he said unto him, I'm not that great spirit who knows all things. And the king said, how knowest thou the thoughts of my heart? Thou mayest speak boldly and tell me concerning these things, and also tell me by what power ye slew and smote the arms off of my brethren that scattered my flocks. So now the king's getting a little bolder, and he gives permission, now that he actually sees Ammon as a man and his servant, he gives permission to him to speak boldly, to speak his mind, and to reveal to him how he does all of these things. How are all of these things done? So Ammon, being wise yet harmless, that phrase is a phrase that's in the Old Testament, but it's repeated in the New Testament as counsel that the Lord gave to his servants when he said, be wise as serpents is what it's translated as, but harmless as doves. Okay? Ammon was wise, but harmless, said to Lamoni, wilt thou hearken unto my words? Now, some people might consider this a contractual manipulation. Ammon's basically saying, I'm not going to answer you unless you promise me that you're going to listen to my words and that you're going to believe what I say. But wait, how can I know if I'm going to believe what you say when you haven't said it yet? All right, how's that work exactly? Well, you have to trust. Trust is the key. The exercise of that trust in Ammon is comparable to actually exercising trust in God, because Ammon is representing God to King Lamoni. So it's an act of faith. Okay? And he says, are you going to hearken unto my words if I tell thee by what power I do these things? And this is the thing that I desire of thee. This is what I want more than anything, that you'll listen. And hearken means more than listen. Hearken means to do after hearing. And the king answered him and said, yea, I will believe all thy words. And thus he was caught with guile. So guile in this case means a little bit of trickery, a little bit of manipulation, but considering that Ammon was harmless, as stated by Mormon just a couple of verses before, because he was harmless, this trick, being caught by guile, was something that was to the king's benefit, not to his harm. And he answers and said unto him, I do not know. Oh, wait. Ammon began to speak unto him with boldness and said unto him, believest thou that there is a God? And Ammon says, I do not know what that meaneth. They don't recognize the term that Ammon is using for the word God. If it was the Hebrew term, it was probably Elohim. And he does not recognize that term. And so he asks him again, do you believe that there is a great spirit? Ammon is now using the term that the king uses. And he says, yea, I do. And Ammon said, this is God. And Ammon said unto him again, believest thou that this great spirit, who is God, created all things which are in the heavens and the earth? And again, there's a little bit of confusion. Lamoni says, yeah, I believe that he created everything in the earth, but I don't know anything about the heavens. Where are the heavens? Are they above the sky? Yes, they're above the sky. So they're having to figure out what terminology they can speak in, because they don't both speak the same terminology relating to gods and what gods expect from man. Yeah.
But isn't this a great example when we're dealing with people who don't believe what we believe? We go in where they're at and we try to figure out
Exactly.
how they relate.
It is. It's a wonderful example of what we should do as we're talking to people who don't believe the same way that we believe. We ask, what do you believe about this? Okay. And then we confirm, I believe that. And I believe this too. So Ammon said, yes, and he looks down on the children of men, and he knows all things, thoughts and intents of the heart, and by his hand were they all created from the beginning. Then King Lamoni says, I believe all these things which thou hast spoken. Art thou sent from God? And Ammon said unto him, I am a man, and man in the beginning was created in the image of God. And I am called by his Holy Spirit to teach these things unto this people, that they might be brought to a knowledge of that which is just and true. And a portion of his Spirit dwelleth in me, which gives me knowledge, and also power according to my faith and desires which are in God. Now, Ammon has just taught an incredible concept to a man who has never heard of any of this before. God dwells inside of man? A portion of God dwells inside of man? Really? The king had never heard of that before. And yet, we're all created in his image, and so I'm just like you, Ammon. I was created in his image too. He's not just the God of the Nephites, he's my God too. And you're saying he can dwell in us with a portion of his spirit? Imagine what the king is thinking right now. He's probably wondering, where's this been all of my life? Why am I just now hearing this, and what does it mean concerning me? He's no longer looking at the Great Spirit from the outside. He's now beginning to look at his own relationship with the Great Spirit from the inside as one of the creations of the Great Spirit. Okay? So when Ammon had said these words, then he began at the creation of the world. And he went down through the fall, and he laid out the records and the Holy Scriptures that had been kept by people anciently, and everything that had been spoken down by the prophets all the way down until Lehi. Now, some of that story, the story of Lehi, the Lamanite king was familiar with. But he wasn't exactly familiar with everything in the Scriptures, because the Scriptures went with the Nephites. They did not remain with the Lamanites, and the Lamanites were so angry about the Scriptures going with the Nephites that they didn't repeat. The early Lamanites did not repeat the stories and the traditions of the Scriptures to their children, because all they felt like repeating was how monstrously horrible it was that Nephi stole that from their inheritance. Okay, so what are the major, in that verse, what are the major concepts and ideas that Ammon introduces to the king? Creation, the fall, that there is a record kept, and what the prophets have prophesied of. Now, what did the prophets prophesy of? They prophesied of the coming of Christ. So he taught what our apostles today have called the three foundational principles of the gospel: the creation, the fall, and the atonement of Jesus Christ. That's what he taught. And that probably took hours. There's a lot of material to cover in that. Probably took a very long time. And the whole time, the king and the servants, they're all sitting and listening. And they're all being profoundly affected by the words of Ammon. We don't find that out for a few minutes yet, but we do eventually find out that they are being profoundly impacted by what's being said here. And so then he rehearses unto them the journeyings of their fathers and all of their sufferings and the rebellion of Laman and Lemuel, rebellion of their fathers. And then he expounds to them the records in the scriptures from the time of Lehi, when Lehi left Jerusalem, down to the present time. So what the other prophets, the more recent prophets, have said, including Nephi. Now, why did he need to tell them about the erroneous ways of their ancestors?
Because their view of Nephi was he was a robber.
Okay.
Stole the government from them, stole the records.
And not only their view of Nephi, that he was a robber, but their view of God, that God was unjust in supporting the Nephites. And he had to come to an understanding of, just like he came to an understanding of the fall of Adam and the error made by them, he had to come to an understanding of the error in thought that he still retained from his ancestors so that he could turn to Christ and let go of that. Right? Did it take faith for Ammon to declare the sins of the fathers to the king? Yeah, it did. It did take faith and trust in the Lord. So then he goes on to expound to them the plan of redemption and how it was prepared from the foundation of the world and made known through various prophets and through various revelations. After he had done all of this and said all this to the king, it says, believed on his words. Obviously, we are getting from Mormon a condensed version of what happened here. He's not going to bother telling us everything that the king said. He just lets us know that the king believed on his words. Okay? And it came to pass that after the king believed, he began to cry unto the Lord, saying, O Lord, have mercy according to thy abundant mercy, which thou hast had upon the people of Nephi. See, he still just feels a little bit on the outside of this relationship with God. But he says, treat me the same way you've treated the Nephites. Have mercy on us the same way that you have had mercy on them. And have that for me and for my people. He's not just asking for himself. He's asking for his people. He's the king. He has that right to ask gods for things for his people. And so, when that happened, when he had cried that, what then happened? Okay, this is where we get that marvelous experience of him essentially passing out, is what it appears as from the exterior point of view, right? So, but is that the only thing that's happening, this passing out?
No, he's somewhere else.
Okay, he is, in his mind, he is in the presence of the Savior and ministering angels. We don't know in what order, we don't know everything that was said, we only know little bits of it, but he is having a godly experience, a God moment in his relationship. And you know what? The queen's going to have one, and then we're going to see the same thing happen again. Why have we not heard about this kind of a thing before? Have we ever heard about somebody passing out as they are having a God moment? Okay, Alma the younger, he was having a come to Jesus moment in a really bad way. All right. Paul had one, didn't he? And did Joseph Smith have one like that? Not quite exactly. He didn't actually, to our knowledge, pass out during the first vision or during the angelic visions, but he was so worn out that later he did, after Moroni came to visit.
He was on his back.
He was on his back, and he did have to come to an awareness of his surroundings And that might indicate that he passed out during the first vision, but we don't know for sure. And Sydney collapsed, wiped out. Yep. Okay, so he was really worn out by the experience. And we've seen that worn out thing a lot, but we don't have too many records of the unconscious thing. Okay, so part of that is because those records have been taken out of the Bible. And those records actually exist in other places throughout Jewish literature, but they just don't exist in the Bible. As a matter of fact, it happens with Isaiah and one of the kings that he goes to visit. Okay, Isaiah goes to visit a king and he testifies to the king of a certain prophecy of what's going to happen, and the king passes out on his bed. And the servants come in thinking he's dead, thinking that they're going to need to take Isaiah's life. And Isaiah says, no, he's not dead. He is in revelation with God. He's having a God moment. So the servants wait. And eventually the king does rise up. And it strengthens the faith of everybody in the king's palace, all of his servants. Those kinds of things actually happened long before these points in time. They just aren't recorded very well for us. You know, it leaves me wondering what kind of records someday are going to come forth that are going to allow us to see how God has worked consistently with mankind throughout all of time, and yet we don't even know how consistent it is. We don't even know how many times people have been thrown into a fiery furnace and have been saved from the fire. And how many times not? We don't know a lot of those stories that existed anciently. Did you guys, because I think I told you that happened to Abraham, right? You guys all know that that's part of the Abraham story according to the tradition of the Jews. He was thrown in a fiery furnace, and God came and walked with him in that fiery furnace. And so facing the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, knowing that story, are thinking of Abraham and saying, God can save us from this fiery furnace, but if not, we still have faith in him. What things are happening here that were seen previously? This is one of them. This passing out of the king is something that Ammon would have been familiar with from the stories of Isaiah, who was just prior to the time of Lehi's leaving Jerusalem. Okay? So he sees another God moment here. And what is Ammon's response? I lost your, need your face, dear. His phone shut down. Does somebody want to pick up reading where I left off for us until he brings that up? Go ahead.
So do you want me to start in chapter 19 or in verse 43 of 17, or do you want me to start?
I thought we were in 18.
That's what I meant.
43 of 18.
And it came to pass that his servant took him and carried him in unto his wife, and laid him upon a bed, and he lay as if he were dead for the space of 2 days and 2 nights. And his wife and his sons and his daughters mourned over him after the manner of the Lamanites, greatly lamenting his loss.
Okay. So they think he's dead, but Ammon is quite sure that he is not only because he's got the relationship with the Lord that he can receive inspiration, but because this moment is very familiar. It's a moment that he has seen before. So let's see. Because my lesson material closed out, I don't have that story. I'll share the story of Isaiah with you next week in detail from the records that we have. But needless to say, this causes a stir, and this is where we begin to see Abish coming in, the queen questioning how long my servants say he stinketh, but I don't think he stinketh. Okay? He doesn't seem to stink to me. How hard is it to tell when a body has started to decay versus just when it's got sweaty pits that stink? Because his body is still producing the sweat and everything. He's not dead. And so he probably does stink, but not the right kind of stink for a burial, for a sepulcher. And yet the servants are saying, man, he stinks. So she's got to fight off the servants and their desire to bury him before he gets putrid. Go ahead. What does it say in chapter 19 then? Let's go on into chapter 19. John, have you found it yet? Good.
That after 2 days and 2 nights they were about to take his body and lay it in a sepulchre, which they had made for the purpose of burying their dead. Now the queen, having heard of the fame of Ammon, therefore she sent and desired that he should come in unto her. And it came to pass that Ammon did as he was commanded, and went in unto the queen, and desired to know what she would that he should do. And she said unto him, the servants of my husband have made it known unto me that thou art a prophet of a holy God, and that thou hast power to do many mighty works in his name. Therefore, if this is the case, I would that you should go in and see my husband, for he has been laid upon his bed for the space of 2 days and 2 nights. And some say that he is dead, but others say that he is dead, and that he stinketh, and that he ought to be placed in the sepulchre. But as for myself, to me he does not speak.
Okay, so she seeks Ammon because she's heard that he can do wondrous things. She's exercising faith and hope at this point, again, in something that she doesn't know, but trust in a Nephite, of all things, who her servants have told her is somebody that has mighty power from God. And she's doing anything that she can to save her husband, but she is exercising faith here. What kind of faith is she exercising?
She believes Ammon has power.
She's heard that he has power. She's heard the words that he's a prophet. And so she's exercising faith that what she has heard from the servants is true, and is asking if something can be done to ratify that faith. All right? So then she goes on, and this is Ammon. Ammon is thinking, this is exactly what I was hoping for. I was hoping that this would spread. And so he says to her that that Lamoni is just under the power of God. Don't worry, he's not dead. He's just under the power of God. And in his mind, Ammon knew that veil of unbelief was being stripped from his mind and cast away from his mind. And now I want you to notice something here. And the light, which did light up his mind, which was the light of the glory of God, which was a marvelous light of his guidance. Yea, this light, look at how many times the word light is being used in this verse. And glory, the things that describe God, which was a marvelous light of his goodness. Yea, this light had infused such joy into his soul, the cloud of darkness having been dispelled, that the light of everlasting life was lit up in his soul. Yea, he knew that this had overcome his natural frame, and he was carried away in God. The declaration here is that it is the light of God that had overcome his frame. Now, you don't normally pull that out of that verse. But the reason that we can pull that out of that verse is because Joseph Smith gave us a wonderful insight as to the nature and character of God and the light or the glory that surrounds him, what it looks like, what it feels like, and the kind of experience that an individual that is unused to that light has when he encounters that light in huge proportions. instead of just little small proportions, because God can control how much of that light he sheds to man. And he generally steps us one step at a time along the way. But with the king here, he is allowing him to experience greater quantities of those light, speeding the process along a little bit, but allowing the king to have a marvelous manifestation because the king's word is going to impact all of his people. And it was a very well understood thing that the gods talked to the kings. That was something his people could exercise faith in, because to them, that is of course who God would talk to, is the king. And then the king bears the message from God. So that's where we're going to leave off for right now. It's time to end class. But the faith that Lamoni had, his little bit of understanding concerning the Great Spirit, was mingled with the traditions of his fathers and with some ideas that carried on to the Mayan cultures and to other cultures in South America after him of this vengeful God. We can see where he got it from, where his fathers got it from out of the Old Testament, but he had to be converted to the concept of a loving God, which is essentially what Christ came to the world and did. He converted the Old Testament God of what people see as vengeance to what people understood as a loving God that would give everything to redeem his children. That gives everything, including his life and all of his suffering, to keep them from suffering. This is the God that Ammon is trying to help Lamoni come to understand, and that now Lamoni is having a personal experience with. Remember the pattern that Alma laid out in chapters 12 through 15, where he said, first comes the messenger to bear the word, and then the individual acts in faith. And if they act in faith, then God comes, and with his spirit bears witness. Well, this is that moment for King Lamoni. Okay, so we're following the exact same pattern that Alma said we were going to see and continue to have in these stories as they're laid out before us. And it's the same pattern that we've come to expect in slightly different ways as we pray about the Book of Mormon and receive a witness to ourselves of the truthfulness of the gospel. I bear you my testimony that God has always worked this way. He always sends messengers, and then he always confirms his word with the Spirit. And that is a promise he's given in these latter days as well. But then, after you've received that confirmation and you continue in obedience, there is yet more to receive. Don't stop there. Don't stop looking and searching for more. There is more of the Spirit. There is more of the Lord for us to receive as we obey and serve and seek and knock and ask, because you're not going to get it if you don't seek and knock and ask. Because the Lord doesn't force himself on anybody. You've got to ask. And if you think you're done, then you're done. Bear you that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Can I have somebody offer a closing prayer for us? We might be here forever. We could just stay and chat.